Oh, hell, Internet! This is the summary video to Tradition and the Modern Age by Hannah Arendt. If you want the full deep dive into the essay, then you can find that here. The title of the essay is accurate. We ask, how is tradition related to the modern age, and how is the modern age affecting tradition? To find out, predictably for Arendt, we must return to the beginning of tradition and examine it. Arendt divides the essay into 4 parts, and what I have called the epilogue is an addendum to part 4. Part 1 looks at the beginning and the end of tradition. Part 2 introduces the 19th century rebels. Part 3 looks at how those rebellions unfortunately failed, and Part 4 looks at where this leaves us. Spoiler, it isn't in an easy position. So in Part 1, Arendt identifies the beginning and the end of tradition in Plato and Marx respectively, and she restates the case that Plato turned philosophy away from the actual life of humans, and that Marx, above all, wanted to reconnect philosophy to the actions that people take in the world. But he was unable to achieve this because his utopia seemed to be aimed at a time where the very thing he wanted to protect would cease to be by his own efforts. This contradiction and others like it are at the heart of the essay's concerns. Arendt goes to considerable detail on these 3 premises of Marx. 1. Labour makes man. 2. Violence is the midwife of history. And 3. Philosophy interprets the world, but the goal should be to change it. But each of these 3 pose similarly fundamental questions to Marx's utopian goals. If labour is the most human and most productive of man's activities, what will happen when, after the revolution, labour is abolished? If violence is the midwife of history, and violent action therefore the most dignified of all forms of human action, what will happen when, after the conclusion of class struggle, no violence will even be possible? Finally, when philosophy has been both realised and abolished in the future society, what kind of thought will be left? Something else that comes up in Part 1 is scholae, the idea of free time or leisure time. But it should be remembered that for the Greek citizen, this was not time free of labour. Greek citizens had that by definition. This was time free of politics, i.e. time free of the human world to be focused on things that transcend the world. In terms of the modern world, Arendt does not go into the idea of what scholae is, but we should. In Part 2, Arendt continues that it was not just Marx who suffered from such problems. The current form of the thread of tradition is the inevitable result of the Romans accepting Greek thought as their traditional foundation. And as it came to the 19th century, this tradition was starting to become discordant. The thread was beginning to fray. This discordance, in the form of revolutions and turmoil, caused the emergence of totalitarianism as a new postmodern political system. The harbingers of this were Kierkegaard, Marx and Nietzsche, the so-called 19th century rebels. But because the sheer size of the unknown before them was so awe-inspiring, and because they had no concept of it, they reacted out of fear. And fear leads to anger, and this is the source of the radicalizing impulse in the face of change. This is how it all becomes so unproductive, and yet tragically understandable. But it is all in our hands now. Kierkegaard, Marx and Nietzsche were at the end of tradition because they dismantled the Platonic hierarchy of God, world and man, as distilled by Hegel. In Part 3, we see that the 19th century rebellions failed in their own terms, although they may have succeeded in doing something else. Each of them was undone by a conceptual duality, which is where Taoism comes into this, Natch. Kierkegaard tried to use doubt to support faith, and by doing so he made religion subject to legitimate doubt. Marx tried to use philosophy to support action, and by doing so he made philosophy subject to production. And then Nietzsche tried to use the real world to support the transcendent, and by doing so he lost the meaning of both. Obviously, one sentence does not cover the nuance, but much of this is similar to the contradictions we saw in Marx in Part 1. In every case, it turns out that something the rebels wanted to attack was actually integral to something they wanted to protect. This comes back to the notion of value. What is it that we feel we want to protect, and why? Traditionally, there is an agreement that the ideal has value, and standards and measures are what translate Platonic values into the real world. But now, society has become the bearer of value. Marx saw society inherit values through the raising of labour to the highest aspect of humanity, and a demonstration of freedom as such, because everyone has the free ability to act, and everyone's ability to act is the same. The extent to which this is true can be debated, of course, but unfortunately, the parallel effects of classical economics has made value subject to the emergence of market forces. The very notion of value has begun to disintegrate. This is what is known as the devaluation of values, and despite its paradoxical character, I think you can see why the term is appropriate. There is another crucial point, though, that Arendt makes here. This socialization of the realm of value is not something that Marx did to value. This is the very presupposition of classical economics, the mixing of labour with resources to create value. The only thing that has changed is the scale of such enterprises. And this has alienated the worker from the value of their task, and, says Marx, this has unavoidable consequences. In part 4, Arendt shows how the tradition's beginning actually led to all these contradictions. First of all, she makes the frankly very Taoist assertion that all perspectives on a duality have meaning only in the existence of the opposition, and so as long as Kierkegaard, Marx and Nietzsche thought of themselves as inverting or somehow opposing Plato, there would always be some kind of problem like this. However, beyond this, Arendt makes the deeper claim that it was Plato that made Western philosophy dependent on dualities in the first place, but that he did this in his own opposition to Homer in the characterizations of the allegory of the cave. Consequently, Plato's project was actually subtly different from the one that even he thought he was making. The Periogoge of Plato is rendered in 3 parts, with the second being nominally the most important. There is the freeing in the cave, where the philosopher is led to the fires that make the shadows. Then there is the witness to the sky, where the philosopher witnesses the true light of the real world. And finally, there is the return to the cave, the philosopher penetrating its gloom once more. But underlying this is a greater turning, and this turning is a metaphor for the great turning away from the real world, and it's underpinned by Homer's rendering of Hades, the underworld. And Plato compares it to the lives of those chained within the cave, which you will recall is the everyday world of humanity. In trying to overcome tradition then, Nietzsche thought that he could get a return to the Homeric age which admired prowess and action, and that this would somehow save value. But it turned out that Plato, by opposing himself to shadow and illusion, created the idea of duality and gave it political purpose in decrying but not negating Homer. Therefore, to simply invert Plato will not give us Homer's response, and it will not return us to the Homeric position. This language of turnings and inversions is extremely vague, and Arendt can be accused of this quite easily. As with many of her more grandiose metaphors, we are left to wonder exactly how would this be meaningful in the real world? And Arendt's response might be simply by its story. This is not a science, but a narrative. In the end, I think Arendt does give a nuanced account of the end of Western tradition as she sees it, and she does put plenty of detail into why she thinks certain causes have led to certain effects. If it is to be effective, however, though, it must be taken as an opinion, and this is something that she showed us in Truth and Politics. She does not fully expand the scope of her case either. If there is a thread of Western tradition, then there is unquestionably a thread of tradition guiding other cultural edifices also. Clearly, Arendt would agree with this assertion. How could she not? But she never addresses it. However, this should not be taken as cultural bias as much as it is intellectual prudence, although the limited scope is the outcome in either case. As to whether the tradition truly has ended, and truly in the way that Arendt describes, clearly it is not a slam dunk. There are many different ways to interpret the many turnings about of history, and Arendt has only given us one narrative, albeit one that justifies itself and the existence of narratives in general. This could lead us, though, to tentatively accept that if there is a phenomenon that can be identified as the Western tradition, then it has indeed been interrupted. But this result would probably also happen to the Indian or the South American or the Chinese traditions, and the strands of history will continue to propagate into the substratum of time nonetheless. We might validly ask ourselves then, has anything truly been lost?